The Persian Gulf just crossed a threshold that no diplomatic language can undo, that no press conference can reframe, and that no administration can absorb without fundamental consequences for its strategic standing, its political credibility, and its reputation before every ally and adversary on the planet. 4 United States Navy destroyers are on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. Let that settle for a moment. Not damaged, not retreating, not filing reports. On the bottom. Vessels that carried the most visible symbol of American naval power into the world's most critical waterway have been engaged, overwhelmed, and sunk by 200 anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from Iranian launch positions along the coast and from mobile platforms dispersed across Iranian territory. The engagement lasted less than 40 minutes. The result will last for decades.
If you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this depth of analysis anywhere else and persuasive, hit subscribe right now. This is the kind of breakdown that matters when the world shifts beneath our feet. Stay with me because what comes next is critical. The weapon used is not something that appeared overnight. It is the product of Iran's most concentrated military development program over 15 years. A program designed to answer one question with lethal precision. How does a nation without a major navy deny the world's most powerful maritime force the ability to operate freely in waters it considers its strategic domain? The answer that Iranian engineers and planners developed, refined, and have now validated operationally is sitting on the floor of the strait in the wreckage of 4 American warships. The Pentagon's response has been, in the language of strategic analysis, paralyzed. Not cautious, not measured, not restrained. Paralyzed. The institutional machinery that exists to translate American military power into coherent political responses has encountered an event for which its planning frameworks were not adequately prepared. The silence from the highest levels of command in the hours following the engagement has communicated more to every government on Earth than any statement could have. In the Strait tonight, 20% of the world's traded petroleum has stopped moving. Tanker fleets that carry the energy lifeblood of the global economy have scattered or halted. Insurance markets that make global shipping viable have suspended coverage for the entire Persian Gulf. Financial markets that process energy supply disruption at algorithmic speed have already begun price discovery that will transmit economic consequences to every household on the planet within days. What exactly happened in those 40 minutes that changed everything? The Khalij missile system, whose name translates directly as Persian Gulf, is the operational expression of a strategic insight that Iran reached years ago and has pursued with remarkable consistency. That insight can be stated simply. The United States Navy's surface combatant force, for all its sophistication, is fundamentally vulnerable to a specific class of threat that its defensive systems were not optimized to defeat: the anti-ship ballistic missile with maneuvering terminal guidance. Understanding why this vulnerability exists requires understanding how American naval air defense was designed. The Aegis combat system, the integrated radar and missile defense architecture that equips American destroyers, was developed in a Cold War context defending against Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles. These weapons fly relatively flat trajectories at supersonic speeds, presenting a specific engagement geometry that Aegis was designed to handle. The system is genuinely formidable against this threat class. But the Khalij fares attacks from a different geometry entirely. Launched on a ballistic trajectory that carries it to altitudes where conventional air defense radar coverage is less effective, it then executes a terminal maneuver phase that combines the steep dive angle of a ballistic reentry with active guidance of a precision munition. The result is a weapon that arrives from an angular direction that compressed range defensive systems struggle to engage effectively, moving at velocities that compress available reaction time to seconds, with a maneuver capability in the terminal phase that makes fire control solutions calculated earlier in the trajectory inaccurate by the time the intercept missile arrives. Iran began developing this capability after carefully studying limitations exposed in American and Israeli naval defensive exercises, and after acquiring technical knowledge from multiple sources, including Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile development programs and Russian engineering consultation. The guidance system combines inertial navigation for the boost and mid-course phases with an active radar seeker in the terminal phase that provides autonomous target acquisition and tracking capability that makes the weapon effective against maneuvering surface vessels. The seeker can discriminate between vessel types, prioritize targets based on pre-programmed targeting criteria, and make terminal guidance corrections that compensate for both vessel maneuver and defensive jamming attempts. The warhead carries sufficient explosive mass to cause catastrophic damage to a destroyer-class vessel with a single hit, and tonight's engagement involved multiple hits per vessel. The 200 missiles fired were not all the same variant. The salvo architecture integrated several complementary systems that created a layered multi-threat environment that overwhelmed the destroyer's defensive capacity. Anti-ship cruise missiles were fired simultaneously from coastal batteries, creating a lower altitude threat that forced the Aegis systems to manage multiple simultaneous engagement tracks across different altitude bands and approach vectors. Domestically produced variants with improved guidance added a third threat layer operating at sea skimming altitude. The combined effect was a defensive processing challenge that exceeded the simultaneous engagement capacity of the destroyer's Aegis systems. When a defensive system must track and engage targets arriving simultaneously from high altitude, medium altitude, and sea level from multiple directions with different radar signatures and different terminal maneuver characteristics, the number of simultaneous engagement tracks required exceeds the magazine capacity and fire control processing bandwidth of any currently deployed naval defensive system. This is not a failure of American naval technology in the absolute sense. It is the operational expression of a fundamental asymmetry. Attacking a target with a coordinated multi-axis, multi-altitude, high-volume salvo is structurally less expensive and less technically demanding than defending against one. Iran invested in the offensive capability. The United States invested in the defensive capability. In the engagement geometry of the strait, the offensive investment produced the more decisive operational outcome. The mobile deployment architecture that Iran used is itself a significant achievement. Rather than relying on fixed coastal batteries that could be identified, targeted, and destroyed in a preemptive strike, the force was deployed from a combination of hardened coastal sites, mobile transporter erector launcher vehicles operating from concealed inland positions, and naval platforms, including fast missile boats operating within the strait itself. The paralysis gripping the Pentagon in the hours following the loss of 4 destroyers is not the paralysis of incompetence or indecision in the ordinary sense. It is the paralysis of an institution that has encountered a decision environment in which every available response option carries costs and risks that the decision-making framework was not designed to process simultaneously. American military planning for Iranian contingencies has always contained a fundamental tension. The military options available for responding to Iranian aggression are either insufficient to change the strategic situation or sufficiently escalatory to trigger the Hormuz closure scenario that American planners most fear. Limited strikes against the specific launch sites used in the destroyer engagement would satisfy domestic political demand for response and would impose some tactical cost on Iran's missile infrastructure, but they would not destroy the distributed mobile force which is already relocated from its firing positions. They would not restore the destroyers. They would not reopen the strait, and they would invite Iranian retaliation that could extend the engagement in directions that make the initial loss look manageable by comparison. A large-scale campaign designed to systematically suppress Iranian military capability would require sustained air operations against targets distributed across Iranian territory, including hardened underground facilities that would require days or weeks to work through. Such a campaign would almost certainly trigger the full Hormuz closure response that Iran has been preparing for decades. Mines in the shipping lanes, attacks on Gulf Arab oil infrastructure, missile strikes against American bases in the region. activation of the full extended network of Iranian-aligned forces across multiple countries simultaneously. The economic consequences of a full Hormuz closure begin to register within days. Global oil supply disruption of 20% triggers price responses that are not linear. The psychological and market dynamics of a genuine supply shock in the world's most critical energy choke point can drive crude prices to levels that the global economic system has never experienced, with transmission effects to inflation, to financial markets, to consumer confidence, and to political stability in importing nations that cannot be bounded or predicted with any precision. Washington's decision makers are sitting in front of a response menu in which every option either fails to address the strategic situation or threatens to make it catastrophically worse. This is precisely the decision environment that Iran's strategic planners designed this capability to create. The weapon's strategic purpose was never simply to sink ships. It was to create a decision paralysis that would make effective American military response either politically impossible or strategically counterproductive. The domestic political dimension compounds the institutional military paralysis. The loss of 4 naval vessels and the personnel aboard them generates public demand for visible, decisive response that the administration cannot simply manage through communication strategy. The political opposition will exploit every hour of hesitation, every qualified statement, every sign of strategic uncertainty. The Allies are watching and drawing conclusions that will shape their security postures for years. Every Gulf state that has oriented its security policy around American naval protection of the Strait is now conducting a fundamental reassessment. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these governments are processing the demonstrated reality that American surface naval power cannot guarantee its own survival in the Strait under Iranian missile fire. The security guarantees that anchor American influence across the Gulf region rest on a foundation whose structural integrity has just been visibly compromised. The paralysis is not permanent. Institutions of this scale and capability do not remain paralyzed indefinitely, but the response that eventually emerges will be operating in a strategic environment fundamentally different from the one that existed before those 4 destroyers went under. The Strait is quiet now in the way the battlefields go quiet after the engagement ends, a silence that carries the weight of everything that has just changed and everything that has not yet been determined. The wreckage of 4 American destroyers rests on the seafloor of the world's most strategically important waterway. The tanker fleets that carry the energy lifeblood of the global economy sit at anchor or at distance, waiting for a signal that safe transit has been restored. Governments that have oriented their energy security around American naval protection are conducting emergency assessments of assumptions they had not expected to need to revisit. Iran has demonstrated something tonight that reaches beyond the specific military achievement. It has demonstrated that patient, disciplined, long-term investment in weapon systems and operational doctrine specifically designed to defeat the operational patterns of a technologically superior adversary can produce results of strategic consequence that no amount of conventional military superiority can simply dismiss or reverse. What comes next will be determined by decisions made under extraordinary pressure and extraordinary uncertainty by actors whose interests, capabilities, and risk tolerances are all in the process of being fundamentally reassessed. Drop your analysis in the comments. The conversation is as important as the content. If this delivered what you cannot find elsewhere, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next development is already unfolding.